Hi everyone, it's me, Tim, and today I want to talk about villains in my appropriately lit Villain's Lair. So I've done a video about bosses where I talked about bosses being encounters that tested how well the player was getting at the game using that particular character. But villains are different. Villains are bosses, but all bosses are not villains. Villains are the the characters that drive the story, and usually there at the end there's a encounter with the villain who is a boss, but the villain is the one who made the whole story proceed. So I wanted to talk about what makes a good villain. I'm going to define them, kind of give some examples from my games, and then I want to talk about a villain that I did badly that I want to redo. So let's talk about what makes a good villain. I think the best thing about a villain is that their goal is not only believable, you think that they're actually going to be able to achieve this goal, but it's also justifiable in the sense that it kind of makes sense. It's kind of something that you could be convinced is a good thing. Maybe the player can even be swayed to join the villain. I think that's important. It's a lot better than just having this mustache twirling villain that's like, I'm going to kill everybody, or I'm evil because evil. I'd much rather have a villain who is trying to do something that he thinks makes the world better. Maybe it's not what you think is better, but it's a better thing from the villain's point of view. I think what's important for the story too is that the villain is telegraphed, meaning you hear about the villain, you learn things about the villain, you see the effects of what the villain is doing as you play the game. It shouldn't just be a surprise at the end. Somebody pops up and goes, "It was me, Mario." But I'm not sure if you should actually encounter the villain. Some games have you do that, but then they make the villain invulnerable. He always gets away, and I don't like that. But that means if you do want to encounter the villain early, you have to plan for the fact that the players may kill the villain, and that'll end the game early. And that there's nothing wrong with that. You might want to do that. But I think other ways you could do that is the villain could contact the player. Maybe if it's, a sci-fi game, they do phone calls or video calls, or maybe in any kind of game they leave notes, but they can also have intermediaries that show up and talk on the villain's behalf. So let me talk about some villains that I thought we did well on the games I made. And just so you know, there are spoilers here. I'm going to spoil Fallout and Arcanum and The Outer Worlds and Temple of Elemental Evil. So if you haven't played any of those and you don't want spoilers, don't listen. So I think Fallout had a great villain in the Master. You hear about the Master. Actually, you don't even hear about the Master. You hear about mutants, and then you finally encounter mutants. And then you learn that the mutants seem to be systematically hunting vaults. And then you run into the lieutenant, who's very intelligent and not what you thought a villain, not what you thought a Master would be. And he tells you about, not what you think a mutant would be. And then he tells you about the Master. And you're like, who is this Master? And he actually implies that the Master has a plan, that he's actually trying to do a good thing. He's trying to unite the wastelands. And when you actually encounter the Master, he tells you that. He's like, look, all the mutants are immune to radiation and they live a long time and I can control them. So I'm going to unite humanity as mutants. Now, what I loved about this is, yes, you can fight him and yes, you can blow him up, but you can also convince him he's wrong by pointing out that mutants are sterile. So I love that about the Master. He's a real person, even though he's two people in a computer glued together. And his plan makes sense, at least as far as he's concerned. Let's move on to Arcanum. I like Arcanum's villain because you play the whole game and you're not really sure what's going on, and someone seems to be trying to wipe out people and tech, And then you find out there's something about the dwarves and the void, and you find out it's Aranax, and now you have to stop Aranax, and you finally get to the void, and it's not Aranax. It's some other guy, Kurgan, who's even more evil, who's masquerading as Aranax. And he has a reason. He points out that life is suffering, so he wants to end life. And he has a really long soliloquy, and it's kind of convincing. It kind of makes you go, wow, that kind of makes sense, wiping out everybody on the planet. Now, I think he's crazy, but I just like the fact that he has a plan, he can enact the plan, and he thinks it's for the best. So I like that. Now let's talk about the Outer Worlds. I liked the villain in the Outer Worlds. Spoiler alert, you have to pick one. Either it's Phineas or it's the board. And you can be on Phineas' side and go against the board, or you can be on the board side and turn in Phineas. I think it's interesting that so many people who played Outer Worlds and talk about Outer Worlds think that the board was the evil group. And I'm really surprised at that, because let me frame this for you. Because if you think this, let me tell you something. Let's take a look at Phineas. Phineas forces you into doing what he wants. He doesn't even ask you. In fact, as soon as you can ask a question, he just ejects you right down to the planet and pretty much tells you better do what he says, or you're going to have explosive cell death or whatever. Now keep in mind, his plan, because food grown on the colony of Halcyon isn't nutritious. It's over the generations, it's lost its nutrition. His plan is to defrost all the engineers and scientists on the Hope and get them working on this problem. Now look at it this way. His plan requires a lot more people to be eating whatever food is left, and he's hoping they'll solve it. And if they do, great. If they don't, the end of Halcyon comes even faster. And the end is catastrophic. There are too many mouths to feed already, and he's putting more mouths out there. Now let's look at what the board's planning to do. They're saying, why don't we freeze part of the population or keep working on the problem? But that'll give us a long time to solve it, and nobody has to die. Everybody gets to live their life even though it's time shifted. Let's look at their plan. If they succeed, great. They can defrost everybody and everything can go back to how it was. But if they fail, nobody dies. People just have to continue to live their lives in this time-shifted way where part of the population always spends its time in cryo storage. Well, that doesn't sound so bad. At least it doesn't have the catastrophic failure that Phineas has. So I would argue that the board isn't the evil path. But what I love about Outer Worlds is it lets you pick. You can decide which one you think is good and which one is evil, and then fight the other one. So that's good. And the whole thing gets telegraphed to you. You know what's going on by the end when you have to pick. Now let's talk about a game I made that I don't think went well. And this is one that I was involved in the writing, and that's Temple of Elemental Evil. I've always said I thought it should have a better story, but one thing I really thought needed to be better about it was its villain, Zugdmoy, the Queen of Fungi, who's at the bottom of the temple. First of all, Zugdmoy isn't really telegraphed at all. You don't hear anything about her the way we wrote it. What I would do now is, if I was redoing that game, is you would hear about her. You would learn that there's some big evil in the temple. The temple starts with that movie showing the Circle of Eight locking some old crone away. You could learn about them. Maybe you can go talk to the Circle of Eight. Maybe you can dig into their records. But then you learn what's going on. So by the time you find the 4 elemental temples, the earth, air, fire, and water, you can talk to them. Maybe you can join one. Maybe you can join all of them. Maybe if your character's a really good charisma-based character with all the dialogue skills, maybe you can unite them. And then you can use them in the big fight against Zugdmoy. But even if that's not what you do, or maybe it is, when you're fighting Zugdmoy, when she surrenders, that option makes a lot more sense. if you're already leading the temples. And then she goes, look, you're obviously the worst evil, the worst of the evils. I'll surrender to you. Also, if she's fighting you and she asks you to join her, that makes more sense because you know everything about her. She's like, look, I'm just trying to, and this is it. Maybe she isn't just trying to be evil and take over a chunk of Greyhawk. Maybe she's saying, look, Loth is far worse than me. I'm establishing a foothold here so I can prevent Loth from doing even worse things. Yeah, I'll control this part of Greyhawk, but I'll keep Loth out. Maybe she's the lesser of two evils. That just makes the story a lot more interesting to me right there. That story is just much, much more interesting. I wish I had done that. Hindsight's 2020. But that's what I think you need to do if you want to make a good villain. So let me recap. Bosses are good for encounter fights, but villains are what drive the story. The villains are bosses, but not all your bosses are going to be villains. Your villains, to be good, should be telegraphed, should have a plan that makes sense and may even be something the player could be made to agree with. And along the way, when you're playing in the game, you should learn more and more about the villain, either by meeting people who work for the villain, getting notes and talking to the villain, and seeing the effects of the villain's plan roll out. I wish I had done that in Temple, and I think it would have made that game a lot better. I think if you follow some of these rules, you can make a much better story for your RPG and have a really good, compelling villain. So I hope this helps.